G'day, everybody, and welcome back to our study group discussing Peter Adamson's A History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps. Today with me, Rogerio Marquez and Graham Pong. And today we'll be discussing a couple of influential Greek figures that lived in the same time as the period we've covered so far, that Adamson calls the pre-Socratics. But people who Peter Adamson did not discuss, and these include Aesop, Hecataeus, Herodotus, Thucydides, Aspasia, and Diotima. Hi, Rogerio. Hi, Graham. Okay, thanks for joining.
Nice to be here.
Great to have another run at the philosophers.
So let's start with the visual aids and work our way through each of these really interesting individuals. So as usual, this is the part of the world we're mainly concerned at right now, especially the Greek world, the Eastern Mediterranean, and these are the main cities, but we will be focusing, as Nerdalian mentioned, on these individuals. So most of these live stream episodes will be treading the path laid by Peter Adamson. Though when Peter Adamson reached Socrates, he left these individuals out who contributed greatly to the way we think about many aspects of life and the world today. And so I'm quite eager to dive into these individuals that, among us three, fortunately, we have knowledge, I think, enough to at least touch upon these individuals and share the knowledge we have about them.
Yeah. I wouldn't say I have much knowledge of any of these people, but I've done some reading about most of them.
It's also really important to mention that although some of these wrote really big treatises or works like Thucydides and Herodotus, also Aesop with his many fables, we can say the same for Hecataeus, whose most of his work was lost, and the two ladies on the right of the slide. So we don't have much material on some of these. So even if we were fully knowledgeable on them, so we would be basically sharing what contemporary humanity pretty much knows about them. So let's start with Aesop. I'll show a slide introducing him, and then we can each share about some things that we know about him. So for Aesop, he's the oldest of the bunch, a 6th century BCE individual who might have been from either Thrace, which is still in Europe, or from Phrygia. Accounts vary. As for his racial ancestry, we don't know for sure if he is from European, Asian, or African ancestry. He could even be quite dark-skinned if from African ancestry. Even regarding his overall physical appearance, we don't know for sure. Some accounts say he's a hunchback or tall and handsome. Although the accounts are in agreement that he was a slave and he was owned by someone, either a guy called Xanthus or Iadamon, who, upon recognizing his brilliance or intelligence, allowed him to travel or even granted him freedom. So he became a traveling storyteller. This is how he probably came up with the stories that survive to our day. And he was probably traveled to main cities in the Greek world like Athens and or Samos. And then as for his death, accounts also vary. It seems that he might have been accused of having contradictory or undesirable political beliefs or blasphemy. And so he probably was executed either from being thrown off a cliff in Delphi or drowned in a well. And what he left to us are dozens of fables, most of them anthropomorphizing animals, where these animals are kind of like typecast. The lion, for instance, is always the strongest. The fox is always the cunning one, etc. And these are quite short stories that fit into a session between a parent and a child to put the child to sleep. And they always have, or almost always have, the lesson at the end, mostly a moral lesson, really clearly stated. So the point is really made to the especially the youth, I think, to whom I think most of these stories were addressed. But I'll shut up now and go ahead, guys.
Yeah, Graham, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, no, I really like bringing in Aesop and some of these other ones because these are almost like some of the threads that philosophy absorbed later. Because the previous philosophers we've been talking about, they weren't dealing a whole lot with the moral issues. It was more just thought issues. And Aesop was a major character back then. He was along the lines of Homer, and just pretty much well known. Basically part of the cultural milieu at the time. And he, his stories, and like Rogerio said about, they were short, they were sweet, they were able, easily to be understood. And he definitely, his writing style was where he would emphasize the aspect of the character, the characteristic of the animal and how it would relate to the people, with the the lazy grasshopper, the industrious ants. And no, it was, he also presages Socrates in the sense of getting himself into trouble politically for telling the truth, and then getting executed for it, is how it looks like. So tagging.
So the thing that stood out to me is because of how early he lived. He lived before we have much of any solid written records of anyone's life. So it's similar time period to someone like Pythagoras or Homer or whatever. And so the details of his biography are mostly mythical and legendary. There are different accounts of his life and who he was. And similar to Homer and similar to Pythagoras, I think many of the fables attributed to him, it's not certain that he wrote them at all. And in fact, it seems that some of the fables were added to the list after he died, probably. And so Aesop's fables are more like fables in the style of Aesop, and like how many of them are his creations is something that we don't know. So a bit of a placeholder figure in history for a kind of philosophy that Plato denied was legitimate philosophy. And in the Western tradition and the European tradition of philosophy, Plato had a big influence on defining what philosophy even is. And so him sort of having disregard for these kinds of fables as philosophy means that even today and through the ages, short little fables like this have played not a big role in Western philosophy in general. Although the article I read on the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy about this makes the point that although Plato and through Plato, in the putting words in the mouth of Socrates, said that those kinds of stories aren't legitimate arguments, both Plato and Socrates make use of analogies and stories like the cave story to make arguments. So they use things similar to Aesop's fables to do philosophy. So it's so the author of the article argues it's clear that these kinds of stories do afford doing a kind of philosophy, and especially if one compares it to something like Confucius's Analects, which are also packed full of these really short stories that illustrate different kinds of social behavior, political behavior, to make a point about what's better behavior and what's worse behavior. That's been really productive in the Chinese history of philosophy. So I kind of think that European philosophy missed out a little bit by not not making full use of the potential of short stories as ways of introducing moral questions and moral positions. So yeah, it could have been maybe a more influential role hadn't it been for Plato. And I was always confused when I've seen it, but I've seen a couple of people giving very bitter criticisms of the negative impact Plato had in the West. And maybe this is like one of those areas where downplaying the value of fables in moral instruction was one of the not so positive aspects of Plato in Western philosophy. But that's going a bit afield, some things.
Yeah, I think that Aesop or whoever put together these fables knew a bit about philosophy, about ethics, about consequence of actions. And so, yeah, we have another slide here that I tried to summarize the kinds of topics touched upon the body of work known as Aesop's Fables. There are fables on ethics, gratitude, friendship, skepticism, human nature, appearances versus deeds, reinterpreting suffering, and moral, immoral actions and consequences, kind of similar to the Hindu concept of karma. Actions have consequences, and people, if they aren't aware of that, might find themselves in bad places or undesirable situations. There's also merit in these fables because they are kind of translating relatively complex concepts from metaphysics and philosophy that otherwise will take quite some years for people to get older and mature their minds to start to understand them with more sophisticated approaches like Plato's approach we mentioned earlier. And since these fables brush upon the same, more or less the same subjects that Plato also addressed in his dialogues, but Aesop in a much more approachable way, to my mind, this makes Aesop or whoever is the author of these fables an excellent communicator, besides being someone that understood these relatively sophisticated philosophical concepts.
No, absolutely. One of the things I also note about Aesop that may have run him afoul of Plato is that Aesop is coming from more of the everyman standpoint as opposed to being in the employ of the elite and part of the high society. And basically, that's sort of a dismissing the everyman by the elite. It's like, we don't need him because he's just one of those peon hoi pollois. Tagging.
Yeah. I think there might be a bit of that, or there might be something that these days is called something like the curse of knowledge, where experts in any kind of domain typically forget the difficulties they had in reaching their expertise as novices. And as one develops expertise in any kind of subject, the terms in which one thinks and the kinds of questions that one asks changes over time. And I get to see this firsthand very often when new people join my jiu-jitsu group. And just the way my coach organizes information is very different to the way a complete beginner organizes information. So my coach will say things that make no sense to newcomers, just because they hadn't learned to think, to cluster information together into chunks the way my coach does. And I think similarly, some of these philosophers, maybe they were familiar with Aesop's fables, and they were familiar with Homer and Hesiod and whatever, and that was just common knowledge to all of them. And maybe they'd forgotten, for someone who doesn't know those stories, it would be mysterious how those philosophers ended up at the kind of ways in which they chunked ethical information and social information, because they got there through a path that included things like Aesop stories. And like a person who made a similar point in the context of mathematics education is I think it's Grant Anderson. I may be getting his name wrong. The guy from 3 Blue 1 Brown YouTube channel. When teaching mathematics, he says like professional mathematicians like to start with the abstract statement of a theorem. So this is the point I'm going to make, and then they do a rigorous proof, and then like very advanced tutorage, they'll sometimes won't start with the statement of the theorem first. They'll teach you a very high level abstract language in which the theorem can be stated elegantly and can be proved elegantly. So you start learning a bunch of terms and the meanings of those terms and how those terms relate, so that a theorem can be stated elegantly and proved elegantly at the end. Now, for a beginner with no mathematics training, that's just incomprehensible. It's way too much upfront investment in learning the language with very unclear what the motivation for any of it is. So it doesn't work for most students. And what works a lot better is giving students many basic examples of interesting relations between mathematical facts, and say 5 examples of here's a fact and here's a very similar fact in a different context, and here's a pattern. Here's a similar pattern in a different context. Here's a similar pattern in a different context. Here's a 4th pattern in a different context. Do you see the similarity there? And then from there, your curiosity. Oh, I think I see a pattern. What exactly is that pattern? Can we state explicitly what that pattern is? And if we state that pattern, can we test whether this is a general thing? Is there a way we can make sure that we're seeing a real pattern and not a real pattern? And then you kind of get into different kind of ways to even do informal proofs or just checking oneself. And similarly, I think ethical philosophy can go along the same line. So you start with a bunch of examples of here's a scenario with two characters interacting. Character A acted in this way. This was the consequence. Here's another scenario. People acted in this way. That was the consequences. Here's a 3rd one. Here's a 4th one. Do you see a pattern in those kinds of things? And if we do see a pattern, can we name that pattern? Can we define that pattern somehow? And then can we test whether that pattern holds in general? Whereas without the examples, and if you just start talking abstract terms, abstract definitions for virtues and things, I think for people unfamiliar with that cultural background, that for the Greeks probably would have been taken as just common knowledge. Just everybody knows that anyway. Anyone who has any education would have heard most of those fables. And so they don't think of teaching each other that. They just assume it taken for granted. But as a South African living 2,000 years later, I don't necessarily know all those stories, except for those that have been adapted into cultural products that I have been exposed to. It can be difficult to know why they organized their thinking in ways that they did. And it might have been helpful to first do the stories, do the examples, and then understand like, oh, like this person that thinks might makes right has like 50 fables about how lions do whatever they want with mice and how eagles do whatever they want with like smaller birds or whatever. And for them, it would be obvious that, yeah, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. And that's kind of where the doctrines come from. So yeah, that was a long rant about Aesop.
If I may, you touched some really interesting points, because in Plato's Socrates, he does not like to define things by examples, and wants to go to directly to an abstract definition that nails whatever they're trying to define directly. But we now know today from both these fields of neurobiology and also artificial intelligence, when we are exposing either a brain or a neural network, an artificial neural network, to data, we are basically showing it examples. And it will restructure itself into a pattern that will in some way conform as best as possible to the highest number of examples as possible, as to have a an adequate reaction to these patterns. And so, and also another very important aspect that I found in Aesop's fables compared to Homer or Aesop or Plato rather, is that Aesop's fables don't require any prior reading. You can just dive directly into Aesop's fables and get benefit from them without needing to know some obscure reference that the author is making, while in Plato not so much. If one reads Plato without ever having read, for instance, Homer or Hesiod, there are a lot of concepts that will just fly over people's heads and students' heads really easily. And so this is, I think, one of the aspects of understanding how learning works that is reflected in how these fables are put together. They really kind of show compassion for people who are just starting to get into contact with morality, ethics, and philosophy in general. They could even be understood by a goat herder who never read anything, or a young child. And so it's natural that these things are kind of unappreciated by the intellectual elite, like Plato and peers, who are kind of like in their ivory tower, and they all know these references. A more modern reference to this kind of Platonic confusion for newcomers I found is for sure Nietzsche. If you read Thus Spake Zarathustra without reading basically the entire corpus of the Platonic dialogues, Homer, the Bible, and many other fundamental texts of especially not just Western civilization, but also Eastern philosophy, like Hindu Vedic scripture, Buddhist scripture, etc., 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 you won't probably understand the thing that Nietzsche is talking about. So he's kind of writing a book that he claims is the best book ever written, and no one understood him. Which is completely expected, because the guy put so many obscure references that almost 99.9% of the population won't understand. And this to contrast with Aesop's fables that are approachable like plug and play. They're plug and play philosophy to me.
Yeah, I wasn't thinking plug and play. I was thinking ready to eat, no cooking required. And I think some of that is the disdain that kind of Plato and all had for it, is the idea that I think that Plato and Aristotle liked the idea that you needed to have that background in order to understand their stuff. And the idea that somebody could introduce something that, just anybody off the street could understand it, that can't be as good as their stuff. Tag.
It's like, I'm improving the world. I'm kind of portraying Plato. I'm improving the world. How dare these other guys try to improve the world better than I'm improving the world?
Yeah, we'll see, especially with the some of the points have been made about political philosophy versus history. People have said political philosophers tend not to deal enough with historical political facts. And there's a big debate about it. There's been a recent publication by Cambridge University Press based on a workshop on whether political philosophy is too ahistorical as charged by some commentators, or whether that whole thing is a debate. But yeah, I think there's this element of like enjoying having a relatively simple theoretical understanding that's very difficult to understand, being a sense of pride, and being like a source for the ego to find fulfillment. And then when there are relatively simple examples from the real world or from fictional tales that seem to contradict the theory, I think it's a natural inclination for the theoretician to discount the real world examples or the theoretical or the fictional accounts. So Plato kind of does this with his ideal of forms, where he has this little trick he can do, where if people present him with real-world examples that seem to contradict his theory, he can say, yeah, but the real world of senses will lead to illusion and lead you astray. There's this higher metaphysical realm that you can access directly with your intellect, and only intellectuals like me can access that. I have accessed that, and because of my special intellectual access to this magical metaphysical realm, your empirical proof, your empirical evidence that my theory is incorrect is irrelevant, and nobody needs to pay attention to that. That's me making maybe slightly ignorant.
We have some objections to our portrayal of Plato by a commenter, Philip Valente Rosa. But I would like to know what exactly does he object to in our portrayal or our way of talking about Plato, so we can address his objection. Anyway, go ahead.
I was going to say a lot of what Nerdalian's saying there is the whole, Plato was definitely an elitist. He was basically, his whole political philosophy is you need leaders who know what's going on and the masses need to stay ignorant. And again, I could see him seeing Aesop's fable as being destructive to his goal, where the masses don't remain ignorant if they actually learn stuff. So, tagging.
Yeah, so in the Republic, he has this theory where people are born with different tiers of soul. So you have your golden souls and your silver souls and your bronze souls, and slaves and people who are hardly worth calling people are these creatures born with lesser souls. And philosophers like him are people born with golden souls. And yeah, I don't think that's misattributing ideas to Plato.
Yeah, I also think that is extremely wrong. This idea that people are born with a certain grade of soul and they remain with that grade of soul throughout their entire lives, by virtue of what we know now from neuroplasticity, from neurophysiology. We know that even the adult brain can change quite dramatically through time, especially if people consistently dedicate themselves to a pursuit that changes the brain, like learning a trade or learning philosophy. And so this is wrong, and it's similar to how the ancient Vedic texts that stated a story about different human beings or different castes of human beings being born out of the feet or the thighs or the head of a goddess, then turned into these castes that have been, even today, affect how Indian society works. And so Aesop's fables are kind of like an element of upliftment of the human mind that could even help a goat herder have some social mobility, perhaps even slaves. And we are just discussing a person, Aesop, who probably when he was born into slavery, probably he was underprivileged, but he maybe heard these oral tales that were mostly orally told, and he probably his mind started to shift gears, and he was only supposedly freed by virtue of him developing a nimble mind. And so even though he might have born into a status of copper or bronze or iron, as Plato would say, he probably ascended to a higher status. And so there's a kind of if we take at face value this idea of souls being graded by these metals, there's the philosopher's stone that alchemizes copper into silver and into gold and so forth. So and to address what Philip was saying, that he's saying that it is wrong to consider Plato kind of like an elitist thinker that disparages other thinkers. Well, consider that at the hands of Plato, many writings, such as of Democritus, were burned because they were in opposition to Plato's doctrines. And this kind of tradition of suppressing knowledge didn't end with Plato. It continued through the Middle Ages as people from within the Christian Church claimed they had better connection with truth and God, just very similar to what we described from Plato. That isn't to say that Plato is only a vile and evil person. He was a brilliant writer. He wrote very interesting and thought-provoking dialogues, and his body of work is quite brilliant. But I think it's important to remind ourselves that no individual is absolutely perfect, and Plato isn't a perfect individual by any means. He has his flaws, and he probably did some harm, not only good. And to go back to Aesop, we can give a few examples of lessons in his fables. A few like pride goes before a fall. This is so prevalent in many Greek tragedies, the fall after hubris. Then persuasion is better than force, which kind of shows why sophists were so successful. So even if we aren't convinced by the fable, we look at history and see the things working. Birds of a feather flock together. You see this with the subcultures, especially, for instance, in youth, like the Goths all together, or all roaming together and whatnot, or the philosophical schools of ancient Athens, the Platonists or the academics all together, and they would intermingle very little with, for instance, the Epicureans, and there was probably a lot of rival between them, and there was kind of like this otherness of how they looked at others. And then we have evil tendencies show at a young age, and so evil should be nipped from the bud. Misfortune tests the sincerity of friends. So many people who consider others friends find themselves perplexed or even surprised when things get rough and their friends just disappear. If so, probably they were just fair weather friends. They were kind of superficially interested in the other because of some superficial benefit and weren't connected at a deeper level. Example is more powerful than precept. This is in current contemporary times best shown with how Richard Feynman showed that the O-rings in the Challenger shuttle disaster were the culprit by instead of answering with arguments and rhetoric to the journalists, he just picked up an O-ring, put it in ice cold water, and then showed how it became brittle. And so he silenced the entire room by showing by an example instead of argument. In injuring others, we are apt to receive a greater injury. And so what goes around comes around. This is kind of like the idea of consequences of our actions, the idea of karma as being actions. Our actions, they have consequences. Things might come around, might take some time, but they often come around. Once a coward is found out, his pretensions of valor are useless. So this speaks for itself. It is hard to forget injuries in the presence of him who caused the injury. This really showcases how deep-rooted conflicts between peoples are very difficult to heal, like the conflict between Greece and the Turkish peoples, or between Israel and Palestine, and even today between the Russians and the Ukrainians. These things will continue to perpetuate in the future. Many people foresee that between Russians and the Ukrainians, these wounds of conflict will remain open for centuries to come. People won't forget these injuries and offenses very easily. We should not deprive others of blessings because we cannot enjoy them ourselves. It is kind of pointless to act out of envy, just to wish ill upon others, even if we can't benefit from what they are benefiting from. So these are just very few examples of many dozens of fables that survive to our days. I even conjecture that some of these fables might have had Babylonian or Egyptian origin, because there are anthropomorphized stories in papyrus scrolls, for instance, that really tempt me to think that there were fables traversing kingdoms. And so Aesop could have come up with his own fables, but maybe he was also akin to the Grimm brothers, who compiled stories that were being shared mostly orally before they were committed to writing.
Yeah, so the nice thing about fables are how short they are, and I guess the kind of really basic narrative structure is something that's inherently easy to remember. So yeah, so they were orally transmitted for a long time, and they're suited to oral transmission because they're really easy to remember and to retell.
Yeah, no, I was going to pick up on, it's easy to understand that anthropomorphizing stories would come from Egypt with the way their gods were with the animal heads. And no, you know, some of what you were saying there, I definitely flashed on the idea of intellectual gangs of Athens, with the, you know, the gang of the academy versus the gang from the Lycia versus all of the other ones. And that was definitely going on a little later when we get to get a little later in our philosophy studies. And that's kind of also emphasizes where Aesop's kind of odd man out there, because he's much more of the everyman. Because part of the point of being the gang is having the other person to argue against. And on all of these, how do you really argue against Aesop here? Tag.
Any ending remarks, Nerdalem, on Aesop before we move on to the next guy?
No, I think we can move on to the next three guys. Actually, more or less go together.
Yeah, we will see in a single slide how these guys go together. I think it will be really interesting. Okay, so the next individual is from Miletus. You've probably heard about this town by now. Very famous, very nice producing philosophy town. So Hecataeus of Miletus, he was living in Ionia, as originating from Miletus during the Persian occupation. And so he became a citizen of a vast empire that extended from Greece to from the Greek world to India and China, and even to the Caspian Sea, perhaps. And he traveled a lot during his lifetime and wrote about his travels, also draw maps. He built upon the map that was created by Anaximander. We will see this evolution of map creation in a bit. Maybe he even entered into contact with these peoples from the Far East. The problem is his writings did not survive to our times. And so once again, this is just another example of the tremendous and unforgivable and despairing loss of knowledge and wisdom from the past that probably will never be found again. He had a very interesting character development arc. He probably started as a person who would take these myths and legends from his forefathers at face value, like people having just a few dozen generations before they believed that they were descended from divine beings. And so his successor, Herodotus, accounts on the inception of skepticism in Hecataeus. While he was visiting Egypt, he talked with priests of a Theban temple, who showed him a series of statues in the temple's inner sanctum, each one supposedly set up by the high priest of each previous generation. Hecataeus insisted he traced his descent through 16 generations from a god. There is another example, like Plato and Solon, claiming that they were descendants from Poseidon. So Hecataeus is not the only guy from ancient Greece to have these kinds of beliefs. And the Egyptians thought his claims were nonsense because compared to his meager genealogy of 16 generations, they could recount 345 generations down to the past, where they were all mortal men, not involving any divine agency. So probably this kind of shock between cultures, between a very early, very ancient culture as ancient Egypt, and the much more recent and much younger culture of ancient Greece, probably struck Hecataeus and prompted his mind to start thinking seriously about these kinds of stories that these peoples of ancient Greece told themselves, and probably prompted him to have this good old Ionian skepticism and down-to-earth thinking, instead of just claiming everything is attributed to gods. And so when he wrote in these writings that we don't have, unfortunately, he probably mostly wrote stories that are mostly based on facts rather than injecting fiction. And he's also known as the father of geography because of his contribution to the world map. He said, "I write what I deem true, for the stories of the Greeks are manifold and seem to me ridiculous." And probably this came from his travels. He probably found different Greeks from different islands and different cities holding different beliefs. And he probably, and even more so, by confronting these stories and beliefs with other cultures and other traditions from other kingdoms like Egypt and Babylon, Persia, and whatnot, he probably, things started to connect in his mind, and he probably figured out that probably most of these stories, if not all of these stories, are farcical and are false. So I will shut up and let you guys go ahead.
Yeah, so in preparing for this episode, I actually learned a little bit. I did not know that Hecataeus was the earliest recorded historian, Greek historian, to sort of take a skeptical, secular approach to history. I thought that was Herodotus, but it's not exactly Herodotus's achievement. So I was glad to correct at least one misperception. And yeah, I really like that story of a guy traveling to Egypt thinking he can trace his descendants all the way back to God 16 generations ago, and then being met by hundreds of generations of men. You'd be like, oh, oops, maybe not.
I was going to say, I could also see a bunch of Greeks saying, well, I must be better since I'm only 16 generations from a god rather than hundreds. No, I was going to say, one thing that jumps out about Hecataeus is, why did he get left out of the whole Milesian group? Because he definitely seems like he belongs part of the mix with Anaximander and Thales and all. Because he definitely seems to be, again, another step forward from there. Clearly a midway point between them and Herodotus and the historians, and definitely picking up from Anaximander with the father of geography sort of situation. It's a shame we don't have his writings. Tagging.
He probably also was a substantial influence on Herodotus, who we will see hailed from not a very distant place. But the slide that the slide that I most wanted to share with you guys for this entire session, if you guys remember only one slide, is this slide here. So as we've talked about Anaximander in the beginning of our journey, he made one of the earliest maps that we know of produced from an ancient Greek, Hecataeus, built on the foundation laid by Anaximander. Added a bit more of details by virtue of his travels, and then Herodotus really knocks the ball out of the field by expanding even more and showing that the world is even bigger than it seemed. And this trend will continue on until the Middle Ages, when people start to really sail, really sail in the open ocean and discover that the world is, or at least prove that the world is a globe. By contrast to ancient Greek guys like Eratosthenes that demonstrated mathematically that the world is a globe. Tagging out.
Yeah, not much more to add to that. I'm a nerd for many things, but geography has never been quite the thing that grabbed my attention most. But it is clear, like the successive improvements in terms of detail and accuracy.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's a lot like with a microscope when you're bringing something in, or telescope when you're bringing something into focus. You get the largest details first, and then as you get in there, it becomes more and more clear. And that definitely seems to be what you're going from Anaximander to Hecataeus to Herodotus here. Tagging.
Speaking of which, Herodotus is our next mentor, basically. So he was from Halicarnassus, very, very close to Miletus. From a peninsula in the eastern seaboard of what is now Turkey, and western seaboard rather. So he was born in Persian-occupied Greek city of Halicarnassus. Wrote a detailed account of the Greco-Persian Wars, his histories, some of his main contributions, and scholars say that he performed a systematic investigation of historical events, though he would infuse some of his histories with some myths and tales. But for what it's worth, I think he kind of explains that they are part of the folklore. As someone who has not read Herodotus yet, I'm not sure if he really clarifies what is historical reports that he is writing and what is myths and legends that the different peoples he reports about hold. He learned the Ionian dialect during his childhood, and so he is part of the Ionian tradition for sure, known as the father of history. So we have two fathers here, the father of geography, Hecataeus, and the father of history, Herodotus. Herodotus also was an admirer of the democratic institutions of Athens in the time of Pericles, and he moved there probably by virtue of the turmoil in Ionia due to the Persians. And so his histories cover many battles, famous battles like the Battle of Marathon, Thermopylae, Artemisium, Salamis, Plataea, and Mycale. He also provides cultural, ethnographic, geographical, and historical background. So he's a historian, yes, but much beyond just a historian. He reports on many different aspects from the different cultures he writes about. So since he includes legends and fanciful accounts, that's some of the criticism that he receives, but it's probably addressable by people that know him better than I. I kind of disclaim here that I don't know Herodotus so much, but I leave it to you guys if you know a bit more to share.
Yeah, so I haven't read Herodotus in the original, but I have sort of read summaries about Herodotus and also Thucydides. And one of the ways in which they contrast is Herodotus was quite meticulous about citing his sources. So I think he includes folktales and fables and myths and things, but it would be from the frame of went to this town, spoke to these people, this is what they told me. And then they told him myths and folklore and rubbish, but he's like, reporting honestly, I spoke to those people, they told me this story, write it down. And then I spoke to different people, they told me this story. And when the stories would contradict each other, he would leave it up to his audience to decide for themselves what they believe to be true or not true. So he didn't take very strong stances about the stories. They did go through some lengths to avoid just plain lies. But yeah, he wasn't as strict as Thucydides in sort of removing myth and legend from history, just included in his accounts.
Yeah, I was going to say my take on Herodotus, and again, I haven't read a huge amount of him, but it's sort of like he sorted things into two categories: those things he experienced himself and those things that other people told him. And that's where he was very, like Nardalian said there, he was very meticulous to say, this is what these people say, this is what these people say, and sort of like leave them all up to the reader to decide for themselves. And I see Thucydides, again, he was making a slightly different, narrowing it down with only what he kind of found the most reliable source in his favorite version, which Herodotus would often weigh in on the one that he felt was the most believable or most likely to be true. But that didn't prevent him from listing everything else out. And I think to a lot of people, having those alternatives is something that they don't want alternatives. They want the official version. And I think Herodotus, including all of the various options, regardless how ridiculous it may have sounded to him, is kind of a feature, not a bug in his history, as opposed to the later ones. Tagging out.
Yeah, I agree. This reminds me of a passage from Epicurus, where he tries to, a much later philosopher, where he tries to wrestle with the explanation of lightning. He lists like 10 to 20 possible explanations of lightning. None of them are based on supernatural ideas or gods. But he also isn't eager to claim one of those possibilities is the true one, because he doesn't have any means to verify. And so I think this concept of showing different viewpoints regarding what Herodotus reports has merit and is worthwhile, because people who expose themselves to many different ideas without having the eagerness to jump and grab the shiniest one just at surface value, it can really help develop the intellect to have this kind of approach. Basically, more training data for the neural network, especially good quality training data, is a good asset.
Yeah, so earlier I said Hecataeus introduced a kind of skeptical realism, trying to sift through the weed and present the truth as rather than just sort of relating the traditional story as was told to him. And I thought that's kind of Herodotus' contribution, but no, his real contribution was he was quite well off. And actually, I might be confusing this with Thucydides, but he spent considerable efforts trying to systematically consult various sources of information to try to triangulate on a truth or converge on truth, and wasn't able always to converge on one version of a story. And then would just present the results of the systematic investigation at length rather than try to synthesize his own own summary of it.
If I may show a quote by him, which is basically what he writes in the beginning of his histories. So he says, "Here are presented the results of the inquiry carried out by Herodotus of Halicarnassus. The purpose is to prevent the traces of human events from being erased by time and to preserve the fame of the important and remarkable achievements produced by both Greeks and non-Greeks. Among the matters covered is, in particular, the cause of the hostilities between Greeks and non-Greeks, mostly the Persians, the Medes, as they would mention." It's kind of like him setting the tone and making a kind of a commitment to being as impartial as possible, non-discriminatory as possible, even toward non-Greeks, even though he is a Greek, and try to show different perspectives, which is something that clearly flourished in Thucydides.
Yeah, he comes across as sort of an ancient version of the Wayback Machine, where he's trying to preserve, like, that they try to preserve every website, regardless of how useless it might be. And Herodotus was doing that for all of the various stories and such for back then. Taggins.
Yeah, early attempt at the Wayback Machine. So it's an interesting way to summarize Herodotus.
Okay, so the next guy is probably influenced by Herodotus, and he is Thucydides. In contrast to Herodotus, who is from Ionia, Thucydides is a true Athenian. He was both a historian and a strategos, which is the ancient Greek term for general. There is a possibility that he even attended a lecture by Herodotus after Herodotus moved to Athens. He is called the father of scientific history. And he was present at one of the battles of the Peloponnesian War, the Battle of Amphipolis. Unfortunately to him, that battle went terribly. He was... although he might have been a really good historian, he probably, at least for this outcome of this battle, probably not an excellent general. And this defeat resulted in his exile. And this very exile is the reason why we have his history at all. So they kind of said, you won't do any generaling anymore. we want you out of here. And so he was banished. I'm not sure to where, possibly to Thrace or something like that. And from this viewpoint, he tried to gather as much as possible accounts from what was going on in this war that he considered to be a really great event in world history. And so his legacy is exactly the account of the Peloponnesian War, by contrast with Herodotus or Hecataios, who reported on a much wider topic of different peoples. Thucydides concentrated or focused on what was going on between Athens and their allies, and Sparta or the Lacedaemons and their allies, just in the Greek world, just this only this war in particular, which was a long war. It spans a few decades, and so his writing is specifically and exclusively on this war. And he is the exception that confirms the truth that the victor is the one who writes history. He was on the side of the losers, but he wrote one of the best accounts of a war from the ancient world that we have today. And he also strikingly wrote about the war in opposition to Homer, without ever citing any gods as to what went on in the battles, which makes him really deserving of the name of a scientific historian. Tagging out.
No, I was
Yeah.
going to say. Oh, go ahead, Nadalian.
The version of the story I read, although my memory is a little vague about the battle at Amphipolis, was that the Spartan general was scared because Thucydides had quite a reputation as an intelligent person, wise person, and so he didn't want to go up against a competent general. So he managed to end the battle before Thucydides even arrived. So Thucydides was still on the way, and then the Spartans already sort of dominated and gave very mild, I guess, surrender conditions, and so got the Amphipolis people to surrender before Thucydides showed up. And because of what a big loss that was to Athens, the Athenians would just decided that's being late is no excuse. That's intolerable failure on Thucydides' part. You're fired and exiled.
Yeah, thanks for complimenting me on that. That part I really didn't memorize from the reading of his history, which even though I read, probably a good chunk just went through one ear and out of the other, since I read it in the form of an audiobook. But a few parts of it stood out to me, and I gathered a few excerpts from his history. So besides that,
give Graham a chance to chip in.
Yeah.
Right before going on.
Yeah, no, I was going to pick up on a couple of points there, and that was, what Rogerio said about history, being written by the winners. It's like this history only got written specifically because Thucydides lost. He was the loser. And in a certain sense, it almost seems like he could also be called the first war journalist, where that's what he was reporting on, was basically the war going on. And I almost see that him adopting the more scientific approach was a direct result of him basically having no dog in the fight after Athens exiled him. It's like he can't be for Athens anymore, and he's certainly not going to be for Sparta. So he was just basically, relating, it with, kind of unbiased towards either side, sort of Walter Cronkite-like. Tagging out.
Here's a quote by him. So he says, "I lived through the whole of it, being of an age to comprehend events and giving my attention to them in order to know the exact truth about them. It was also my fate to be an exile from my country for 20 years after my command at Amphipolis, and being present with both parties, and more especially with the Peloponnesians, by reason of my exile, I had leisure to observe affairs somewhat particularly." So even though he was bright, what happened in his life by virtue of circumstances further promoted his vantage point and the possibility that he received reports from the battlefield from both sides. And what stood out to me in his history were these handful of parts. So thanks to him, we have an account of what Pericles said, and we can get a sense of the character of Pericles, who was the Athenian leader until early on into the Peloponnesian War, when a devastating plague struck Athens, and a couple of years after the plague started, and many people died. Even Pericles himself died. And so, even though probably dying, I think at the age of 40 something, Pericles Pericles' speeches were preserved by Thucydides, who not only reported on the battles of the war, but also of the events that explains the war itself, like the foreign policy of Athens, causing the Spartans to become ever more frustrated and distressed, because the Athenians were aggressively creating bonds of clientship with these client states or client city states, pretty much in a sense like a mob or a mafia would do. They would demand from the city states protection money, and they would have to pay tribute to be considered in league with Athens, and they would also be promoted or encouraged to adopt a democratic system of rule, whereas the Spartans and their allies were much more of an oligarchic or tyrannic kind of rule. And so even if not for the expansionism of Athens, there was also this very different way of conceiving leadership or conceiving government that was creating a divide between the Athens and the Lacedaemonia or Sparta. And so these many parts in Thucydides' account of what happened before, during, and during the war. He'd also died before the war ended. So we don't have kind of like the war ends, the Peloponnesian War ends, and the end by Thucydides. It kind of ends midway. But the part that we have has highlights like the speech where Pericles advises Athens to start the war instead of just delaying the war until things get even worse and their adversary is even better prepared, because they knew that the adversary Sparta was preparing for the war. And the more that they would delay, the worse it would be. The more armor and the whatnot, soldiers and mercenaries the Spartans probably would have. And so Pericles advised to start the war and advised them to wage the war, especially using their naval capacity instead of trying to go on land against the much better land soldiers, the Spartans, to kind of harass the Spartan settlements through the naval bombardment from sea to these coastal settlements. In the middle of the war, Pericles does a funerary oratory speech, which was traditional during wartime in Athens, as I've understood. He praises Athenian democracy and raises the spirits of the Athenian youth and soldiers. Then there was the Mytilenean revolt and Mytilenean debate, which was a very dramatic event that allowed Thucydides to report on profound moral and ethical concepts that were going on. So the Mytileneans were a city in the island of Lesbos, when I think, if not the biggest island, the largest island of the Aegean Sea, one of the largest, and they wanted to revolt against Athens and declare independency. The Athenians wanted to quash the rebellion and just slaughter the entire male population and enslave women and children. They sent a ship to enact this punishment. And suddenly, some wise people from Athens, one of them was Diodotus. He urged them to reconsider this severest of punishments, and used some profoundly philosophical concepts, and also these ideas of punishment, absolute punishment would bite back at Athens later on. And so he convinced the assembly to vote by a narrow margin to stop this complete extermination of and enslavement of the Mytileneans. And so they sent a ship to overturn the initial decision that was hurried to the island of Lesbos again against the clock. Basically, it had to arrive there before they started slaughtering the entire male population, and it did so. And so I think it's one of the events in history that is so profound, and for two narrow margins, an atrocity was averted. The first one, a narrow margin of vote in Athens, and the other one of a narrow margin from the arrival of the second ship to the island of Lesbos, and they prevented this massacre. And so I think this is a high point of what happened there. And also, in a pre-Christian Greek world, this idea of not meeting a lesser or inferior people that rebelled against a mightier Athens without just going eye for an eye, to me it stands out as showing that human nature is possible of compassion without explaining it outside of the framework that people usually use to explain this, with the Christian doctrine that didn't exist at this time. To me, it's a really interesting occurrence in this whole affair. Then there was the corruption of thought and meaning of words in the turmoil, and I think this is worthwhile of doing a really short reading.
I just want to
go ahead.
Carry on with that. This what's it? Mytilenean revolt story makes me think of one of Aesop's fables. I just saw a couple of them, so by no means familiar with all of them, but it reminds me of the Lion and the Mouse, where the mouse accidentally ran over the lion's tail. The lion was sleeping, woke the lion up, upset the lion. The lion caught the mouse, and the mouse was sort of pathetically begging for its life. And the lion decided killing such a pathetic creature would just be a cause for reproach later, not a cause for honor. So he let the mouse go.
And the lion left even. The lion even left at this proposal by the mouse.
Yeah. And then sometime later, the lion got caught in a human hunter's trap in ropes. And so was himself in a desperate situation. And then the mouse came by, remembering the mercy of the lion, just started gnawing on the ropes of the trap and freed the lion. And so a little story about a superior force showing mercy to a smaller, like a weaker opponent, being in Aesop already. So yeah, this.
Yeah, I was going to say I had a couple comments on the Mytilenean situation as well, and again, I could see a different moral being delivered if the second ship doesn't get there, and that's the idea of, you need to come to the right decision first, and even if you come to the right one later on, sometimes it doesn't matter. And the other one that really stood out for me is the similarity between that and the whole Roman rape of the Sabine women, with part of the Origin of Rome Foundation. And so I just, again, that jumped out at me for those people who know the Roman history there. So I just wanted to note those and tag.
Another tidbit from history that I became familiar with all this journey of the ancient world that we are on was I started to become a bit more familiar with the history of the Assyrian Empire, and they were notoriously cruel towards the peoples that they conquered, and they enslaved, they massacred, they just were a people that delivered horror to whoever was in their path. And eventually history basically annihilated them, erased them from the trace of historical record. people around them, all the nations, all the peoples around them were so disgusted and fed up with their modus operandi that eventually there's always a bigger fish. And so eventually they were completely annihilated and shown no mercy, because for so many decades or maybe even centuries, they showed consistently no mercy towards the people that they oppressed and conquered. And so I think this is the fable, as you mentioned, Nerdalium, the several occurrences of this kind of pattern in history, where people, the stronger, either shows mercy within reason, or completely shows no mercy consistently. This kind of reveals itself in the patterns of history. Often tyrants that are bloodthirsty, like Caligula, Nero, and Commodus, meet a violent end, and an early violent end at that. And this is kind of consistent. Even though there are some outliers of tyrants living to a ripe old age, there is a tendency, because people become really angry at them, really vengeful, really plot against them really intensely. Even if regardless of us talking about the level of individuals as tyrants or entire nations like the Assyrians or the Romans, these things kind of create bad feelings or hatred that can persist through centuries, and goes to the accomplishments from Hindu philosophy of the concept of karma. When people mistreat others and create bad feelings, karma is merely just their actions, and their actions produce consequences. And these consequences, for the most part, at least initially, are invisible, because they are manifest inside people's minds, inside people's emotions. And these emotions, they build up through decades, through generations, through centuries, and they might flourish in retribution.
Yeah, so one thing that Thucydides was noted for is previous historians, Herodotus and Hecataeus, and also basically all of the previous, call them bards, so people who told stories in myths and legends, and poets and stuff, would take a very sentimental, moralistic approach to events, where kind of a moral stance and a sentimental stance was notably absent from Thucydides. So he was very much reporting, this is what happened, and this is what happened as a result of that. And as a result of that, the following happened. And yeah, so because of that, he's also considered one of the early contributors to political realism, which is a school of political theory where people sort of analyze international relations based on sort of cold, calculated self-interest and things like fears and angers and revenges and stuff, and not so much on moral ideals or universal principles of what's good. Thought that was worth bringing up.
Yeah.
No, definitely. I was going to say the only other thing I would note is, the Assyrians definitely lived up to their name, ass searing, because they definitely took that to everybody that they fought. Tag.
Okay, if you guys can bear me, I'll just do a small reading on how language is distorted during times of turmoil, which might even persist even after the turmoil ends. So this comes from Book 3 of the History of the Peloponnesian War. While the conflict was raging and people were revolting, there were internal civil strifes like rebellions, democratic parties trying to oust oligarchs and vice versa. And so we have this, due to the strife of war, words had to change their ordinary meaning and to take that which was now given them. Reckless audacity came to be considered the courage of a loyal ally. prudent hesitation, specious cowardice. Moderation was held to be a cloak for unmanliness. Ability to see all sides of a question, ineptness to act on any. Frantic violence became the attribute of manliness. Caution plotting, a justifiable means of self-defense. The advocate of extreme measures was always trustworthy. His opponent a man to be suspected. To succeed in a plot was to have a shrewd head, to divine a plot a still shrewder. But to try to provide against having to do either was to break up your party and to be afraid of your adversaries.
Yeah.
We kind of have these kinds of notions today when people talk of things like toxic masculinity, for instance, when they say that there are people that think that only these male guys who are constantly doing displays of power, like this guy who is imprisoned right now, who is
shall remain nameless.
Shall remain nameless, yeah. Who was imprisoned and he has several charges against him, but we are not sure if they are true or not. But there is this pattern of manliness being correlated with gratuitous displays of displays of power and even aggression and violence, while the most noble aspect of masculinity is kind of hidden or obfuscated, which is, I think, a tragedy, because the more philosophical and more noble potential of masculinity, of the expression of masculinity, as opposing here what I just read in Thucydides' account, without the kinds of patterns that philosophy brings, it might fall into obscurity and to darkness, and the only thing that comes to the fore is extremism that comes with violence and aggression, and it's much more correlated with fascism and the stuff that happened after the Bolshevik Revolution and Mussolini and the Third Reich. But moving on, to these, if you guys want to comment, feel free. Otherwise, I'll move on to the other examples.
Yeah, I was going to say something on that one, and I definitely see the parallels there. And I think if Thucydides had lived after Aristotle, he would have sat there and said it forces a breakdown in logic. Because in essence, what they were doing there is arguing, and again with Mr. Nameless in jail here, you know, the idea of you take one extreme example and say that example is emblematic of all males. It's a, you know, it's a logical fallacy, and basically in times of strife and war, Thucydides is saying those logics breaks down, and it's basically the everybody just bands together, and you got to be singing the same song as everybody else. Tagging on that.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have much more to add to that, other than noting it's like a well-documented phenomenon that when emotions run high, people do become less logical and their thinking becomes less nuanced and more reactive. And yeah, times of war, it makes a lot of sense that fears and angers and grief, like those kinds of negative emotions, run very high at maybe even chronic levels. And so this war continued for years, like for decades. And so that kind of chronic stress actually does brain damage. So it's like over time, an adult who used to be more capable of thinking clearly and in a balanced way could actually become less able because of permanent brain damage that occurs due to chronic stress. So yeah, the Greeks were among the civilization that not the only civilization, but that really stressed the deleterious effect of what they called the passions, which are really just strong emotions, to a rational mind. And like some people have taken that to an extreme and saying like all emotion is necessarily irrational, and all emotional life is kind of contrary to a rational life, which is way too far. It's not possible to be rational without any emotions either. We need some kind of objective function, and our emotions guide us in what we value. But yeah, when they run extreme, they cause problems.
Yeah.
Oh,
I'm
one
also-
last. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Graham.
I was
Go
going
ahead,
to say
Graham.
one last note with Thucydides is in his writing, he definitely sounds like that rational, logical man who got fired by a bunch of angry mob who didn't like him. Tagging.
It sounds like it.
Yeah, there's this metaphor that I really like, which is the passions could be represented as a steed that, if let, it could be undomesticated and be like Bucephalus before being domesticated by Alexander. And then Alexander provides the direction to the steed, and the two together working in concerts went from Macedonia to northern India. And so a really functional and synergistic mind can go really very far and surpass many obstacles. Possibly the utmost potential of the rational mind working in concert with the passions possibly has no bounds. We only have very few examples in history where there is this more or less synergistic process at work between the passions and the rational mind. And I think it really proves the point that it is worthwhile to avoid the extremes of completely suppressing the passions, and then we end with intellectuals that have cold hands, or we have these hot-headed crazy guys that band together like a wolf pack and just mete out violence against anything that moves, that is inferior or weaker. We need humanity to be more wholesome or more holistic and not extreme. Yeah. To give just other of these examples, Thucydides reported on the Corcyraean revolution that was a uprising of a democratic party helped by Athens, that they imprisoned the oligarchic party and then proceeded to slaughter them in an atrocious fashion. They were all closed off in a building, and then the Corcyraeans were leading them out one by one and slaughtering them in a really how should I say it, a way that they would completely humiliate them. And at first, the people in the building were unaware of what was going on. They thought they were just being laid out and moved to another prison. And then suddenly they found out that their comrades were being slaughtered outside of the building. And then they contrived, by any means possible, to commit suicide. And the Corcyraeans wanted to kill them off. And so they even made a hole on the roof and started to pelt them with arrows. And so this kind of shows, it's a showcase of human nature at its deepest and most deformed, where they knew that they were already committing suicide, but they still wanted to meet punishment against these oligarchs that had been oppressing them for so long. And so, yeah, we can learn quite a bit on human nature in extreme circumstances by the completely unsanitized reporting by Thucydides He didn't kind of hide anything to kind of like to avoid impressing people too much. He also documented the massacre in the Boeotian village called Mycalessus by these Thracian mercenaries who arrived too late to embark on the Sicilian expedition and were sent back to Thrace without payment. There was also the argument that they were charging 1 drachma. They were charging a lot, and so they since they weren't paid, they just pillaged and massacred a village in Boeotia. And there was even this very vivid and completely unsanitized accounts in which they slaughtered everything that moves in the village, even animals, children, women, whatever, and also including children that huddled together in a school. And so these guys killed everyone, even the children that were cowering inside the school. And so this kind of, when we are reading this kind of puts us to a test. Even our mental resilience is put to a test. Me, for myself, as a parent, I was reading this, and it's difficult to not have the emotions well up. But it's also by confronting ourselves with these accounts, we also get into contact with some of the parts of our minds and our human nature. And I think it's really worthwhile and really important to kind of confront these demons of human nature, so to speak. And I'll let you guys comment on what I just said before moving on.
Yeah, there were a couple of places that it seemed clear that people consider Thucydides to have a fairly strong view on human nature that he never explicitly states, but it sort of comes through in the tone with which he writes and the way in which he reports things. And I've actually noticed among other historians that it seems to be studying in a broad range of contexts what people actually do is quite a powerful way to get insights into human nature that complements and go beyond what one would be able to do by other means of learning about human nature, like sort of introspective meditative practices or pharmacological interventions or whatever. So there's like history as a way to glean human nature is an interesting and it's apparently effective approach to learn about people.
What do you make of this, Graham?
Yeah, I was going to sit there and say this is one of those recurring themes in history, the lesson of always pay your mercenaries. That's what cost Constantinople. That's why it fell to the Crusaders of all things. That's who took Constantinople down. It was a matter of the Crusaders got there and it was like, what? There's no bounty, no money, no reward. Okay, well, we're just going to take it here.
And that's how many of the precious texts of the ancient Greek world were lost forever. For instance, almost the entire body of work of Sophocles, I think, was burnt to a crisp in that fateful pillage and massacre at Constantinople. At least by what I read in Isaac Asimov's The Greeks, he claims, and other sources that I've read also claim that it was an important point of loss of heritage.
Oh, no, definitely. That was one of the choke points. I was going to say on the flip side of that sack of Constantinople also forced a lot of scholars to flee with their precious texts, and that kind of helped spark the whole Renaissance later. Tagging on that.
Yeah, also some of the writings that survived were actually the writings that were borrowed by the library. They were the ones that weren't in the library. And the guys who had borrowed them, as you said, probably fled the town, the city. Yeah. history has these ways of kind of having humanity basically lobotomize itself. That's how I kind of paint this picture.
Yeah, the picture I had is someone with an ice pick just picking their nose all the way up. To the
Yeah.
Really dumb.
And to cap off the examples of the Thucydides Peloponnesian War, the last one is the Sicilian expedition. So Pericles advised them to stay within their confines, to battle them in a conservative manner, to not overreach. They did exactly the opposite after the Athenians did exactly the opposite after Pericles died, and his advice was no longer among the voices of the brightest leaders. Instead, there were these very passionate guys calling the shots, like Alcibiades, who wanted to get as much booty as possible. And they turned their eyes to Sicily, of all places, quite far away from the actual thick of it. But Sicily was really well fortified, and it was well prepared to meet out the Sicilian expedition by the Athenians. So many Athenian youth died there, so much loss of life, unnecessary loss of life, on a foolish and foolhardy endeavor. And if they hadn't did this foolish expedition, Athens might have well held out against the Peloponnesians. So this is kind of the nail in the coffin of Athens, of this Athenian greatness, was this, I think, this foolish Sicilian expedition.
Yeah. Like one of the themes in Aesop's fables was greed and overreach being the cause of downfall too. So yeah, maybe if these elites paid more attention to their nursery rhymes, they may have had a better outcome.
Yeah, maybe go back to the basics.
I was going to say that requires the elites to sit there and try to learn a lesson from the everyman that they think they're above learning. So.
Yeah. Then I have these verses here, which were written by a much later British American poet. He says, "Exiled Thucydides knew all that a speech can say about democracy and what dictators do. The elderly rubbish they talk to an apathetic grave. Analyzed all in his book, The Enlightenment Driven Away, the habits forming pain, mismanagement and grief. We must suffer them all again."
Yeah.
So with this, if you guys are up for it, we have two ladies. Time for something completely different. Until now in our voyage, the only thinkers that we have been examining are all guys, all male. There were, of course, wise females, but most of their material they either didn't write or none of it survived. Mind you, we are looking at everything through the filter of medievalism, where the powers that be at the time weren't too kind to many, even men that had disparaging views, like the Epicureans or the Pythagoreans, much less any women that dared to write anything philosophical. And so many things were lost, but still we have some material to check, to examine. One of these individuals was Aspasia, who lived more or less in the same time period as Thucydides and Pericles, Socrates and Alcibiades. But she was born in the Ionian tradition in Miletus. and around mid 5th century, she probably moved to Athens. She had a long-term. She dated Pericles in a long-term relationship. As a foreigner, Pericles couldn't, and Aspasia couldn't marry. Ironically, due to a law that Pericles had passed before meeting her. She was a great rhetorician, by all accounts, who is said to have imparted wisdom on persuasive speech to both Pericles and Socrates. She also, in a dialogue by Plato, advised one couple, encouraging them as a lesson to facilitate or encourage their partner to become a better person instead of thinking about replacing them. Socrates praised her by words written down by Plato. He said, "I happen to have no mean teacher of oratory, and that teacher was Aspasia." And so maybe one of the teachers who made Socrates the sage that we know of through Plato and Xenophon was in part influenced by Aspasia. There's also this dialogue between Aspasia and the couple Xenophon and wife that is really interesting. But maybe before going into this account, you guys could react to what I just said about her, so we can chunk this off a bit.
Yeah, so from what I've read, the relationship with Pericles is a little complicated. Different people report it differently. But yeah, it seems to be some kind of semi-formal concubine. Is that not the right word? I think so. And yeah, it was striking that several of the sources, like there aren't that many sources about who she was and where she came from, but like the only contemporary source in her lifetime was a comedic poet who wrote that she was a kind of prostitute, which various interpreters think of either contest or defend. So those who contest say he was a comedic poet, and what comedic poets say about people who can't be trusted. And then the defenders of the position say, like, well, even for a comedic poet, it would not fly in polite society to label those accusations against a woman of repute. So it's not very relevant to philosophy, but that's something that I struggle to find much on her thinking.
I was going to say she comes across as the first, basically, relationship counselor, marriage counselor, and again, very much with the whole situation with Pericles, it's open to interpretation, but it's not unsimilar to several other arrangements, because several. Vespasian had that arrangement with a woman after his wife died. Again, his son Titus had Berenike as basically his consort. Consort's probably a good term there rather than concubine. And that sort of consort, head wife, even though it doesn't have the wife title, is sort of an old term, ancient sort of tradition. So tag in there.
Yeah. Speaking of her marriage counseling, this is the dialogue in which she addressed Xenophon and wife. So she addressed the wife first. Please tell me, madam, if your neighbor had a better gold ornament than you have, would you prefer that one or your own? And the wife replies expectedly, that one. Then she says, she moves on. Now, if she had dresses and other feminine finery more expensive than you have, would you prefer yours or hers? Hers, of course. Grass is always greener. Then, well, now, if she had a better husband than you have, would you prefer your husband or hers? And she doesn't respond and blushes. And then she addressed Xenophon, her husband. I wish you would tell me, Xenophon, if your neighbor had a better horse than yours, would you prefer your horse or his? He replies, his. And she goes on, and if he had a better farm than you have, which farm would you prefer to have? The better farm, naturally. Then she asks, now, if he had a better wife than you have, would you prefer yours or his? And he becomes silent. And then she goes, and since both of you have failed to tell me the only thing I wish to hear, I myself will tell you what you both are thinking. That is, you, madam, wish to have the best husband, and you, Xenophon, desire above all things to have the finest wife. Therefore, unless you can contrive that there be no better man or finer woman on earth, you will certainly always be in dire want of what you consider best, namely, that you be the husband of the very best of wives, and that she be wedded to the very best of men. And so, reading, or at least interpreting this these words of Aspasia, my interpretation is that Aspasia stresses that if people go down the route of materialism and consumerism and always appropriating themselves with better and better stuff, that might also spill forth to human relationships, and people might go about their lives switching worse friends by better friends, worse wives or husbands by better wives or husbands, at least perceptually better. And instead of that, there is this possibility of kind of rooting for the other one in the relationship, to try to bring out the best of them and to uplift them with your contribution to the relationship. Instead of people falling in love together, there is literally the possibility of people rising in love together. And this, I think you will see, ties also into what we will see for the next thinker. But go ahead, guys. React to this.
Yeah, so she kind of leaves it open-ended and pointing out sort of one logical entailment, a possible logical entailment of always preferring to have a better husband or have a better wife, saying that, well, as long as you always prefer a better husband or a better wife, you will always be in want until you have the best possible wife in the world, be the best possible husband in the world, or other way around. And it seems that implied there is like neither of those things are going to happen. So you'll just, if this is the way you approach life and relationships specifically, you'll always be in want of the best thing in life. Sort of implying that maybe there are other ways to approach relationships, or maybe it's not necessarily. If there are other ways to approach relationships, one way is to focus on mutual growth. Another way is to do a kind of acceptance and sort of focus on loving the person you're with, and you can, with some control over attention, you can just stop doing the comparisons of who's a better husband and who's a better wife, and just focus on loving your partner. Those two aren't mutually exclusive. Like, loving someone is very compatible with wanting them to grow and to flourish as a person, and to help aiding them in that project. But yeah, it's also possible to interpret at least this just paragraph as a kind of cynical statement that people generally will always be in want of the best thing in life, unless by some miraculous chance the two very best people end up married to each other, then they won't be in want of the best things in life, but everyone else is doomed to be in want of the best thing in life.
Yeah, no, I really like the complexity of it, especially since she starts out with the commentary about that failed. And it's basically that inherently implies that she sees a better way of doing things, but since you guys can't do that better way, here's what you can do with what you're currently choosing. because I think she's saying the better way is, you know, at the end there is you would want your own wife rather than the other one, or, you know, on some of those is, you know, again, if it's your neighbor's wife, she picked the neighbor over you, so, you know, if you had her, that wasn't the same sort of thing. And I think that's what she's saying at the beginning, but basically she's saying later on, if you're willing to go with that always trading up, that sort of, you know, hypergamy sort of concept, you know, the best way you can do that is also through self-improvement. That's the only way that you're really going to be able to keep the other spouse. If they're interested in always something better, you better make yourself better than their options. It seems to be what they're saying towards the end. It's like, if you're going to go that way, here's the recipe for how to make that work. Tegan.
Also, how could we decide who is the best man in the world or the best woman in the world?
Yeah, so there's a bit of a back and forth here between goodness and preference, which is maybe a little tricky, like maybe a bit of a trick. So most people consider, just the way the words work, that they prefer better over worse. If you have a better option, do you prefer the better option over the worse option? And so, like, asking if your neighbor had a better wife than you, it's almost baked into the way we use language that if your neighbor had a wife you would prefer to be married to. Would you prefer to be married to your wife, or would you prefer the person you prefer to be with? So I wanted to point out that little sort of baking some assumptions into the way the question was phrased.
There's also, I think, important to call attention to the idealization of others. When we are in a relationship with another person, we at first might have an idealized thought about them, because our brains do that. They kind of pack the person's kind of features or extrapolations on their features, and we have kind of like a doll inside our mind that is not the real person. And as the relationship matures, I think the doll, if we are at least reasonable persons, the doll will start to resemble much closer the other person we are with. And even if even if there is this mechanism of self-improvement that I've mentioned, the doll probably will accompany the other person. But if people are in a relationship with their wife and they are more or less resignated to their wife, and then they look at the neighbor's house and they look at their wife and they kind of see superficially that the wife looks prettier, but they don't know much about how the wife is kind of like living with her full-time, 24/7, etc. You have no idea what kind of inner demons, so to speak, the other person that you are idealizing has. You have already, with your own wife, known her quite a bit and learned how to manage those kinds of inner demons of her and yours and how they go together. And so I think it's kind of like a exercise of extreme hubris and arrogance to kind of compare your wife with the other person's wife or another person that is single or whatnot, and assume that you can say with certainty that the other person is better than your own. I think it's an exercise of hubris, because we are not only comparing individuals, but we are comparing one individual with whom you have a relationship, a much deeper relationship, with another individual that you have a much shallower or no relationship at all. And so by what yardstick does one with confidence compare your current significant other with some other person, and even so claim that some other person is the number one human being with whom you wish to be? The other person could be an unbearable narcissist that could take you to court, like happened with the actor of Pirates of the Caribbean, and the girl in question is very she is very pretty, but her soul might not be so.
It's funny you bring up narcissism, because I was thinking just on a completely different interpretation of what she's doing. And she was we don't know almost anything about her. We know she was a rhetorician, which is the art of persuading it. And so maybe she's doing something like selling her services with this little thing, saying, for you to be happy that you have the best thing in life, what you need is a way to contrive for yourself and for the other, that you are in fact the best husband to be married to, and that your wife is in fact the best wife. And what rhetoricians do is, regardless of the truth of the case, they persuade people of the case. So maybe saying, if you let me teach you rhetoric, I can teach the two of you to jointly contrive together so that you both believe that you're in fact married to the best person, and then you'll be happy because you have the best thing in life. And as long as you can't believe that, you will be unhappy. I can make you believe that because rhetorician.
So the Protagoras route, or the Cypher in Matrix route.
Yeah, might be what she's going for here. So that would be like a couple engaging in narcissistic self-delusion of their own superiority, mutually, and helping each other do that.
I don't think that would be sustainable in the long term to solidify a long-term relationship, though. If she really had a claim of excellence to this, I hope she wasn't advising this one, but it's a possible interpretation for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I was evaluating it from the downside, where it's like, you may not necessarily know that neighbor's wife is the best wife out there possible for you, but you might be able to know that, your wife is so horrible, just about any other wife would be better. Tag.
Fair point. No arguments against that. I think that the most useful comparison isn't between two people, the wife and another. I think the best comparison is between the wife and solitude.
Some wives are worse than solitude.
Exactly. Exactly. There are people that are single and that they are kind of pining about their single status, and I like to tell them, you could be worse, man. You or girl, you could be dating an egomaniacal psychopath,
toxic
abusive person. You are blessed by having this freedom of being single.
There's so much I could say here, but we need to move on to another philosopher.
I know, man. But yeah, you bring, by virtue of your experience, you bring wisdom nonetheless. And thanks. Let's move forward to our last thinker. She is called Diotima, and she is from the Peloponnesus, Diotima of Mantinea. And so this individual has been her historicity and reality has been cast into doubts throughout the centuries by scholars. But according to the sources that I found, it seems that scholars are arriving at the agreement that probably she did exist. Of course, her representation by Plato might be kind of like a gist of her ideas or a caricature of her ideas. But if it is a caricature, it is a kind of a positive caricature, because her ideas are quite interesting. So it's even possible for us to trace the origins of the concept of Platonic love that so many people throw in the air nowadays without describing it or having a grasp of what it is. And the two philosophical concepts that I found from her or attributed to her are the ladder of love and the metaxy, or the concept of what exists between utter ignorance and complete knowledge. So have you guys heard about Diotima before showing any other slide?
No, new person for me, learning.
Yeah, not at all before we started studying her.
Okay, so let's introduce the concepts, the philosophical concepts that Plato wrote into his one of his dialogues. I think it was the Symposium, not 100% sure. So the first one is the Ladder of Love, in which it originated from a dialogue between her and Socrates, and she explains to Socrates that there are several ranks of love. The lowest is kind of like the physical attraction, the bodily physical attraction. And then it is realizing that this bodily physical attraction might transcend just the person that you are physically attracted to. And so a youth might graduate from being clingy to a single person, like really attached, as Siddhartha would describe a calf being attracted to her mother. He really uses this imagery to describe the kind of attraction that kind of subsumes the person being attracted to the object of attraction. But after graduating from these lower rungs, we go more to the realm of the love between minds, or the as they would say in the ancient Greece, the love between souls, which might not only involve romantic love. It might also involve true friendship. When people are earnestly friends, there is a bounty from the relationship, from the conversations and what these two individuals share with each other, that is uplifting. It's morally uplifting. It's uplifts the soul, etc. And so to Diotima, this was a form of love. And then graduating from that, we find that love can pervade entire societies, that the society might not of necessity be so. It might just be a bunch of savages, unstructured savages, in the fashion that Confucius in ancient China would talk about, without having any rituals or customs or whatnot, wouldn't have any social interaction besides aggressiveness and other base means of interacting. And so, since we do have government, despite all its flaws, and other institutions in society, despite all their flaws, there are a minority of people within these structures that really care, within these amongst the sea of these NPCs that are mindlessly and uncaringly keeping these things going on. There are people that care within institutions, despite being difficult to find. There are people that love what they are doing and love the overall organization that they are serving. And this can happen in governmental institutions, schools, business institutions, etc., etc. If not for these people, if the only persons within these institutions were people that don't care and are just go on in there for themselves, they are just self-centered, I don't think that these institutions would have a chance to survive for long. Then there is the love for knowledge. When people graduate to realizing that pursuing knowledge and wisdom is one of the highest activities of human existence, they truly become what we call philosophers. And it's only by virtue of intentionally pursuing knowledge and truth and wisdom, regardless of there being some bitter truths to find, and regardless of there being a lot of scoundrels perpetuating lies and falsehoods that we need to sift through. If the person is earnestly seeking truth, they will eventually accumulate knowledge of worth that relates to how the world works, at least by approximation, through degrees of approximation and by refinement. And eventually the philosopher might figure out deeper aspects of reality, like the true definition of virtue itself or love itself, etc., that sits at the upper part of the ladder. And this is pretty much the Diotimus ladder of love, according to what I've understood of it.
Yeah, I'm quite curious how this relates to the Platonic notion of love. So just based on my understanding of common usage of it, is it's usually used to indicate quite strong feelings of love that are decidedly non-sexual.
Not eros. Eros was the ancient Greek word for physical attraction, sexual love, while I think it was philos is a more refined or more intellectual version of love.
So to me, this seems like this could all be applying to the more philo side, if you're using that word correctly. Actually, the Greeks had a couple of words for love. But yeah, the feeling of love that's not sexual attraction, it seems like this could be focused on one individual, and because it says individual body, that makes it sound like it might be eros, but it need not be. I think it's open to interpretation there. And then sort of noting that that same feeling of love can be expanded across more bodies, and then also noting that it can go beyond superficial things like just the sort of individual beasts, and you can like have love sort of into the soul, into the characters of people, and those that's something quite different. And then yeah, seeing that, and then sort of expanding that into organizations and social institutions. I'm kind of at a loss of like how from social institutions it goes to knowledge. Like the position of knowledge on that ladder is something that confuses me a little bit. I'm thinking maybe from because like this is Diotima according to Plato. So he considers in the city perhaps of the city's institutions and customs or whatever, the philosopher is achieving the highest level in that city. So you have your city and your customs, but your city, Athens, may well condemn your favorite teacher to death, and so they're below the level reached by philosophers who love knowledge. So maybe that's Plato's views coming through more than Diotima's views, because it just seems like she's going sideways, like there's a progression and then a sidestep to knowledge that is hard for me to understand other than if I sort of explain it through Plato's lens. I don't know. Does that make sense to you guys?
Kind of. You're definitely on something there with the expansion. I sort of see it as, with the concept of ladder, that each of these are a prerequisite for the next step up. Where you have the concept of love that's applied to an individual body, say love of the self, and then you're starting to have love for other bodies. And then you're expanding the next step, once you recognize the love for other bodies, is to extend it from bodies to souls. And then once you have a recognition of the worthiness of all souls, then you can sit there and say that then you can have those lovable souls. How do they interact together? and that's where you establish your social institutions and your customs. And once you are able to sit there on that one, you're able to move on to just pure love of pure knowledge itself, and then you take away the object of knowledge, and then you're just left with love itself. On the flip side, I can see kind of where Plato went, where some of his was going with the ladder of dominance, where it's sort of like a dominance and power over, and it climbs all the way up to the top on a different sort of ladder chain. Tagging to see if that makes sense with you guys.
Yeah, I would interpret it as first, before people can really engage in philosophy seriously, they need to feel some safety. It's very difficult to make philosophy work really well amidst turmoil. That's why people fled Ionia for the most part when things went south there. I think that when we realize that we are in a mindset where we realize all other individuals are worthy, and there is worth in all people, even broken characters or broken souls. There is some goodness within them. Only then can we venture into really doing something like statecraft. Because if we try to do statecraft with people that have not graduated to realizing all souls are worthy of love, I don't think that statecraft or organization building will be sustainable, at least on the long term. Eventually, tyrannical patterns will emerge, or people will kind of descend into nihilism or something like that, and the organization will decline, either with a bang or with a whimper. And only when you have functional organizations uplifting society and individuals consistently, can you consistently have really people being called true philosophers, worthy of their name. And only if you have consistently philosophers really going at it can they ever really find the ultimate truth or the ultimate virtue itself. And I think we haven't yet found it, despite some guys trying, but we haven't had kind of like a human golden age that would allow for it.
Well, yeah, so philosophy, the way Plato practiced it, and sort of the people around him practiced it, yes, and I'm inclined to agree with that. But I guess the thing that's confusing me a little bit is it's like easy for me to conceive of some kind of hermit or ascetic that moves into the woods, or even in a small tribe where there isn't much institutions, could have a person born with a temperamental high openness, be just really curious and exploring the world, finding routes between things, tasting all the plants in the areas, sort of messing around with the animals, see what happens. Just a curious individual who really enjoys learning and spends a lot of time learning things. They wouldn't be doing philosophy. But to say they don't have a love for knowledge because they haven't graduated to a love of knowledge that doesn't make too much sense for me.
I could address that. So the hermit that is living away from society, yes, they probably will have a great opportunity to practice natural philosophy for sure, even self-contemplation and self-knowledge, but they will be isolating themselves from lessons of knowledge when people come together. And I've learned quite a bit from being inside an organization myself about not just individual human nature, but also when conflicts arise, social dynamics, and in a way that no book could ever teach me. So yeah, you can pursue knowledge in partiality outside of human society, but you can only put everything together when you also kind of have your soul strings being played by other human beings, in a sense.
Want to chime in on that, Graham?
Yeah, no, I agree with the concept that basically you can't learn on your own. I mean, even the hermit out there, he's learning by interacting with the world around him. And when it comes to humans, part of that is the sharing the learning with them. And again, that comes with all sorts of, they may not want to learn what you have to say. They may actually react poorly to what you have to say. So no, there's a lot to be learned in all areas. And that's always one of my approaches, is I can learn from everything and everybody, even if it's bad stuff I learn. Tag.
Shall we move on to, was it Metaxa? What's it?
Yeah, it's the we're nearing the end. Just wanted to reference the quintessential guy that removes himself from society and returns and no one understands him, Zarathustra. Okay, so the other concept by Diotima is to address this notion that we touched upon from the sophists, where they claimed that people are either completely ignorant or they are completely wise. There's no in between. If people are ignorant, teaching is of no avail, and if they are wise, they don't need teaching. And so they kind of glance over the possibility of there being a traversal between these two shores or these two extremes. And Diotima addresses this. She tells Socrates, does anything sit in the middle position between knowledge and ignorance? And then Socrates doesn't have any response to give her. And she goes into a rant and she says that judgment is not knowledge, because when we judge something or when we think something to be true, this isn't the same as knowing it to be true. But judgment is not ignorance either, because good judgment often hits the mark of truth. And how could what hits the truth be ignorance? Philosophy, like judgment, may be not quite the same as wisdom, but neither is it full-blown ignorance. It is wise, after all, to want to become wise. So anybody who wants to become wise cannot be totally ignorant. And if you want to become wise, by definition, you are not yet wise. So you are between ignorance and wisdom, or ignorance and knowledge, driven by love to become wiser. And then Socrates asks, in that case, Diotima, who are the people who love wisdom if they are neither wise nor ignorant? Diotima replies, maybe tongue-in-cheek, that's obvious. A child could tell you. Those who love wisdom fall in between those two extremes. And so obviously she's joining the words love, wisdom. And so I'm completely tempted to go forward with the interpretation. She and Socrates are aiming at the concept of the philosopher.
Yeah, quite like that.
I was going to say, it jumps out at me. It seems like Diotima and Socrates are kind of playing sophists at each other, because they're playing with a lot of the definitions of words. It's like right here, it's like she basically rephrases his question into the answer. And one of the things that I've never really gotten a full grokking on is what the ancients' difference between wisdom and knowledge was, because they kind of used them somewhat interchangeably at times.
So I think that came up previous time. So there are a couple of different Greek words. So there's Sophia, which is like a theoretical kind of wisdom. There's phronesis, which is a practical prudence kind of thing. There's episteme, which is knowledge of facts, especially natural facts. And there's techne, which is sort of procedural, manual skill. And so they were discussed as different intellectual virtues that one might have. So I'm pretty sure in this case, the word they're translating to wisdom would be Sophia.
Yeah.
a theoretical kind of wisdom.
Yeah, the two on those were basically pairs. The inner ones and the outer ones are kind of inverses.
I would say that wisdom has to do with proper judgment as well, not just with knowledge, but with a way to make the mind work or the soul work that kind of turns the vector of change in the soul towards the ultimate good or virtue, even though it might be technically unattainable in absolute. Otherwise, human beings would be gods. And also, it's I think really important what she states here. She's saying that it's not so important the place where you are on the graph. What matters is the direction that you are facing, and also the momentum with which you are moving.
No, I definitely agree with that one. It's the idea of improvement. And from the very first slide, I think that they're making a point about there is nothing that's involved in thought in between wisdom and ignorance. What's between ignorance and wisdom is more of feeling and belief, as opposed to thought. It's like you can't have the idea of you can't have false thoughts was one of the things that they were going with back there. So you're either ignorant with a thought of ignorance, or you're having the thoughts of wisdom. And in between, I'm seeing that she's filling in. Those are more in the feeling and belief sort of category, which is why they have Socrates not able to actually think of anything. Tagging on that to see if that works with you guys.
So I think that the reason they had Socrates not able to think of anything is Socrates was a little confused about how people learn. So he had this notion. So one of the reasons why they disregarded Socrates through Plato. So when I say Socrates, Socrates disregards Aesop's fables as philosophy is because he rates examples are not definitions, and in any case, to be able to come up with examples, you need to already have knowledge of a definition. So first, we need to figure out the definitions. Then once we have definitions, we can produce examples. Without the definition, there can be no examples, which seems to be mistaken. So I think Diotima is just here taking a more commonsensical approach to learning that's confusing Socrates, because he has some theoretical notions about learning that doesn't quite match how people learn.
There are some concepts of learning with some merit in Socrates or Plato's Socrates or Plato, which is a priori knowledge, which is kind of translated to modern speak. The structure of the brain already allows for advanced calculus, allows for metaphysics, philosophy, ethics, and whatnot. The neural connections for such concepts might not be established yet, or might not be sufficiently reinforced. But with a few examples in experiential learning, where, for instance, someone is at work with colleagues and is constantly overruling the others' decisions and doing stuff without paying any attention to their opinions, they will eventually find by experience these other colleagues getting increasingly frustrated and negative about the individual, and eventually it will bite him in the ass. And so by experience, without any, even if no reading, no talking was involved, by virtue of how people make others feel in this situation, can be a source of acquisition of wisdom.
So I'm not so sure about Socrates and Plato's notion of prior knowledge. I mean, there are instincts and the possibility for learning that people are born with. So that instincts are particularly pronounced for the kinds of things that can provoke emotional responses right from birth. So babies can be scared and be made to cry by unconditioned stimuli, is what behaviorists call them. And those are things that people and animals are just born with a tendency to react in certain emotional ways with, and then elaborate associations can be built up from the starting point. But there's a dialogue in which Socrates talks about how it's possible for a student who's ignorant of geometry to be led through a proof and to make a inference that's correct at the end. And instead of giving a sensible sort of theory of inference and deduction, or I think Plato says, well, that knowledge was always there from birth. What's happening is the student is just remembering. And I may be misinterpreting it, but I think that's kind of like saying, so when someone creates a neural architecture like the GPT architecture, before feeding it any data to learn, the knowledge of language is already there. The training process then is just remembering what was already there. And that's not how learning works at all. Like that's completely a misconception of what's happening. But I think that's more or less Plato Socrates' notion of what learning is in humans. There's a remembering of what was there. Like the forms are imprinted on the soul from before birth. They're the eternal forms. And the task of a philosopher is to remember the form of the good, true, beautiful, just, and all that.
If I may address that really quickly, you made a good comparison between the artificial neural network and the human brain, but the human brain isn't a blank slate when it is formed in the womb. It is already put together with a forest of, I think, many trillions of neural connections that were influenced by the genetic makeup and some stimuli during pregnancy as well, kind of like hormonal signaling from the mother. Even the emotional states of the mother might condition the early what we call neural pruning, which is very pronounced in the first months of gestation, and also especially after the brain develops in gestation, the first months of the brain existing, and also after birth. So there's an extensive kind of sculpting or removing the excess of the neural connections. And so since it is mostly a subtractive process, I think that there is some merit to this idea that the potential of these patterns of calculus, of geometry, etc., they are already there in potential. It's more like a slab of marble, like a huge slab of marble before being carved by Michelangelo into the statue of David. He just removes the excess, and removes the excess expertly with much direction. And I think that for the most part, especially early learning is a lot like that.
Yeah, no, I was going to say I agree with you, and a different way to look at it, Nadalian, is the idea of the forms being this abstract realm. And the idea is those thoughts exist in the realm before you ever have that thought. And therefore, you're basically, since in order to become incarnate, your soul passed through the realm of forms. You have, Plato's saying, you have that memory of that perfect form. And to tie that over into ChatGPT, think of it as like a giant cellular automaton, because that's what it is, zeros and ones. And it's a matter of that end process structure that it forms from all the iterations already exists out there in the abstract realm. It just doesn't ahead of time remember which one of those is the right one. And in that sense, they're saying that learning is very much a process of remembering. It's kind of how I sort of interpret Plato. Going to tag to see if that makes any more sense to you.
I'm not sure. I don't think it makes much more sense, but we're not here to talk about Plato's theory of deduction or Plato's theory of knowledge.
We will get there very
Soon
soon.
enough.
Anyway, sooner than you think.
Yeah. Shall we call it a day?
Yep.
Sounds good.
Yeah. Thank you, Rogerio. Thank you, Graham. And thank you for being patient with my criticism and ignorance.
Likewise.
Yep, it makes 3 of us.
But we do try to nurture love for wisdom, although we might have quite a bit of ignorance to deal with.
I was stamping on some of the wildflowers sometimes.
Yeah.
All right. And thanks to the listeners too. We'll see you again. We're back tomorrow discussing 3 different visions of who Socrates was. Looking forward to that.
Bye.